everyone. Let's begin today's talk with a story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who desperately wanted to become a teacher when she grew up. Every single year, she wrote to Santa Claus for blackboard and chalk. One day, weary of the same request year in and year out, Santa wrote back to say, "Why can you not ask for sensible things like other little girls?" In her naivety, the little girl ran up to her dad and said, "Hey, Dad, you and Santa have similar handwriting." This little girl was desperate to be a teacher, but then that's not unusual. A lot of little girls and little boys too want to become teachers when they grow up. But this little girl's dream seemed absurd because this little girl was useless at studies. Her rank would be 29th out of 35 students in class, and her school reports would read, "Your daughter looks at the water filter as if her life depends on it." This little girl was lonely, miserable, sad, a big crybaby with only one friend. But she refused to give up dreaming of becoming a teacher. By now, many of you here may have guessed that that little girl was me. I happened to finish school, went on to college, but I still hated studies. In the second year of college, there was one teacher who changed everything for me. She virtually changed my life. My creativity, my imagination was so triggered by the passionate way in which she taught literature that I decided to become an inspirational teacher like her. After that, I was unstoppable. I went on to do a doctorate in literature, another doctorate in education, and so on and so forth. I was extremely fortunate to have had such a teacher in my life, but millions of others are not so fortunate. It would be absurd for me to say that the educational system does not work at all and is a total failure. It does work for some, stifles the majority, and leaves out 264 million children worldwide who remain unschooled according to the latest UNESCO reports. I do not wish to sound alarmist, but as the futurist Gerd Leonard says, humanity will change more in the next 20 years than it has in the past 300 years. Historian Yuval Harari likewise cautions us that we will need to face situations that are unimaginable even now. For instance, super intelligent machines, engineered bodies, algorithms that manipulate our emotions with uncanny precision, and the need to change our profession almost every decade. We educators like to believe that we are preparing our students for change and for jobs in future. But in fact, we have no clue of what the future will look like. 65% or more of the jobs that we know today will be rendered completely redundant or change radically in the next few years. So, does our current production line system of education prepare our students to survive, let alone live happily, in 2030, 2050, 2070, and so on? The answer is a resounding no. With the coming together of biotechnology and artificial intelligence, we need to radically overhaul the entire education system. And that will include learning objectives, outcomes, teaching pedagogies, as well as assessment, and all this before 2027, when machines will have the full capacity of the human brain and perhaps also display emotional intelligence. We need to quickly work towards the critical mass in order to prevent technology from trumping humanity. I will explain the concept of the critical mass with a wonderful story called The Hundredth Monkey. This story is rooted in fact. Monkeys on different islands in Japan were being observed by scientists for over 30 years. In order to befriend the monkeys, the scientists gave them sweet potatoes. One day, a little baby monkey called Emo took her sweet potato, washed it in water, and popped it in her mouth, and it tasted nicer without the mud and grime. Her playmates started following her suit, and eventually the entire monkey colony was washing sweet potatoes before eating them. You would say, no big deal, this is simple imitative behavior. But what happened was that on the other islands in Japan also, monkeys started washing their sweet potatoes. The anonymous 100th monkey tipped the scale and change happened. Rupert Sheldrake, who has given us the morphic resonance theory, explains that we need only 1% of people to jumpstart a change, and approximately anywhere between 5 and 25% to reach the tipping point. Needless to say, whatever change we need to make has to be made in the now. So what are the changes we can make in the now? Firstly, we need to customize education. By that we mean help students to locate their specific intelligences, talents, and interests, and shape education accordingly. Second, emphasize life skills more than discipline-related information. Thirdly, work consciously towards a change in consciousness. Futurists today tell us that for every rupee or dollar that we spend on developing artificial intelligence, the next rupee or dollar should be spent on developing and changing consciousness. Inspired by the 100th Monkey narrative and Gandhiji's oft-quoted words, "Be the change you want to see in the world," I started thinking of my contribution to education. In 2013, I came up with a very simple thinking process that I call technopoiesis. This 7-step process could result in a very dramatic change. As you see, the word technopoiesis is a coinage. It suggests the coming together of left brain disciplines and technology, particularly the STEM subjects, with poiesis, which is humanity and the arts. It is, in short, a whole brain process. Technopoiesis is extremely flexible, and it can be adapted to group as well as personalized learning, solo as well as co-teaching. It can be used anywhere and at any level of education, even at home. Technopoiesis nurtures the various domains of development. As you see here, the cognitive, affective, social, as well as spiritual. Once we determine our core goals or objectives, as well as the variable ones, all we need to do is to follow the 7 steps of technopoiesis. So let's quickly review them. Step 1 is relevance. The question here is, why should this be learned? Let me give you an example from my own experience. About 2 years ago, a principal of an IB school called me up, and in a panic-stricken voice she said, "Please do something. My students hate Shakespeare, and they are supposed to face an examination in the next 2 months." I created a fun-filled PowerPoint called, "Boy, that cool dude Shakespeare still rocks." I went to the students, quoted extensively from the various plays of Shakespeare. We had a lot of fun. At the end of the week, however, the principal called up to say that I had created a different kind of problem for her, because with only 2 months left, students wanted to learn more plays of Shakespeare. What did I do? I merely established the relevance of the Bard of Stratford-upon-Avon. Step 2 of technopoiesis is analysis. The question here is, how should the content be learned? Importantly, the analysis is not to be done by the teacher, but merely initiated with the help of critical thinking, activities, mind mapping, visible thinking, and all the amazing new strategies that we now have at our disposal. The third stage is skill development. And the question here is, what are the discipline-specific and life skills enhanced by this learning? Obviously, if we are teaching mathematics, we want to hone the mathematical competencies, geography, geographical competencies, but alongside that, also life skills like collaboration, communication excellence, resilience, and so on and so forth. These 3 steps, relevance, analysis, and skill development, locate the learner in a self versus other consciousness. In a way, that is good, because it helps the learners to identify their own learning methods, their preferences, and so on and so forth. However, the danger is it can keep one locked in competition, and that can be unhealthy. We only need as much competition as salt in food. With that, we move to the 4th step of technopoiesis called interlinking. I know of a lot of teachers who are consciously doing this kind of interlinking in class. There is a scientist from Bhabha Atomic Research Center who teaches the periodic table in chemistry with amazing, memorable stories. I myself, in my practice as a professor of literature, have used dance, drama, music, and a host of cultural texts to explain even the most abstract of literary theories. With that, we move to the next step, which is probing and reflection. The question here is, how are deep thinking and reflection stimulated? This is an extremely important step, for as Jiddu Krishnamurti, one of the greatest thinkers in modern India, has rightly said, our educational system teaches our students what to think, not how to think. With probing and reflection, students learn how to think, and they become self-reliant learners who also know how to respect the differing perspectives of other learners. The 6th step is action. And the question here is, how can students be led to create action plans? It is vital to transfer knowledge to life. This step is deeply empowering for the learner, and at the same time, it reminds the learner of his or her responsibility as a global citizen. These 3 steps, interlinking, probing and reflection, and action, nurture the self and other consciousness. It doesn't have to be me versus you. Therefore, competition is replaced by cooperation. As a management guru, Michael Lee Stallard rightly tells us, we human beings are hardwired biochemically not for competition, but for cooperation. Recently, a lot of curriculum developers are trying to bring in this state of consciousness. However, the problem remains that the other is still the other. With that, we move to the final stage of technopoiesis, which is awareness of oneness. And the question here is, how can learners be led to experience interconnectedness and oneness and develop an all-is self-consciousness? You might have noticed that in the earlier slides, I have spelt S with a small letter s to indicate our mundane personality self, which is ever-changing. This time, S is spelt with a capital S to indicate our intuitive, creative, peaceful, joyful, if you like, higher self. But why is it necessary to create this awareness among students? Like the Advaita philosophers, David Bohm rightly tells us that we have something called the explicit order in the universe. At the level of the explicit order, every single one of us is different, and we are also different from everything around us. But at the deeper, implicit level, we are energetically interconnected. We are one. This is validated by quantum mechanics with the idea of the unified field of energy. The all is self is vital for all students. Initially, when I thought of practicing technopoiesis, I had a feeling that teachers teaching humanities and the arts would be able to easily transition their students to the 6th stage, action, and the 7th stage, awareness of oneness. But teachers teaching STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, would have trouble doing so. Happily, I was proved wrong. And the STEM teachers also are able to lead their students to the final 2 stages. Technopoiesis enhances EQ, our emotional quotient, SOQ, our social quotient, SQ, our spiritual quotient, as well as IQ, our intelligence quotient. So it creates a win-win situation by nurturing what I call sourceful intelligence. Sourceful intelligence is a dual capacity that we human beings have of understanding and experiencing our uniqueness as well as our oneness simultaneously. The upper layers of our mind make us aware of our individuality and our uniqueness, the deeper layers of our oneness. The entire aim of what I'm trying to do in education is to transition learners from a self versus other consciousness to a self and other consciousness, to a point when there is no other and all is self. If we manage to do this, we can help create the compassionate leaders that the Dalai Lama feels the world is so sorely in need for. Technopoiesis is completely aligned to the 4 pillars of learning given to us by UNESCO. The first 2 pillars, learning to know and learning to do, are supported by the first 3 stages of technopoiesis. The next, learning to live together, by the next 3 stages of technopoiesis. And finally, learning to be by the final stage of technopoiesis. I do not tend to buy into the kind of fantasies of some apocalyptic futurists. However, it's very important to know that though human beings have survived near-doom experiences in the past, this time we cannot make the wrong choices. We cannot afford to make mistakes. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in her poem Aurora Leigh, talks about this concept of choices very beautifully. Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But he who sees takes off his shoes. The others sit around and pluck berries. Metaphorically speaking, we could choose to remain berry pickers, but then it's quite likely that we would become living fossils in corners of rooms while the 21st century goes hurtling past us. So let's all get together and create joy and meaning into the classroom, work towards the critical mass for a change in education, and make our rapidly shrinking and increasingly threatened world a better place for ourselves and for the generations to come. Thank you.